3 years ago, I nearly died on an operating table while my husband whispered, "I will keep everything intact." Today, bringing a home-cooked lunch into the glass tower we founded, his young assistant eyed me like trash and dropped a question that shattered the executive floor. I returned to reclaim my seat, only to find he used my weakest years to steal my company, erasing my name under the guise of crisis management. My name is Brianna Kendrick. I am 38 years old, and for the last 3 years, my universe shrank to the size of a hospital bed, defined by the rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor and the suffocating grip of postpartum heart complications. While I fought for every single breath, my husband, Gavin Holloway, swore he was holding the fort. He promised me that our life, our business, and our legacy would remain untouched, perfectly preserved for the day I was strong enough to return. Today was supposed to be that day. Today was the day I returned to the Atlanta headquarters of Anchor Bridge Recovery, the commercial asset recovery consulting firm we built together from nothing. I stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor, my pulse steady, my mind sharp, expecting the familiar rush of our bustling headquarters. Instead, the heavy oak doors slid open to reveal a space I did not recognize. The grit and soul of our company had been sanitized away. The raw steel panels and deep blue logo of Anchor Bridge Recovery were completely gone. In their place, a massive slab of backlit Italian marble proudly displayed a new name in brushed gold lettering, Meridian Harbor Advisory. I stood in the reception area, my feet sinking into a plush carpet that cost more than our entire first-year operating budget. Everything was wrong. Anchor Bridge was a company rooted in the field. We dealt with disaster zones, hard data, complex insurance files, and the physical reconstruction of commercial assets. Our office used to smell of fresh coffee, paper ink, and the ozone of late-night thunderstorms. We were real. But this new space felt like a glossy, sterile showroom designed solely to seduce high-net-worth investors. It was all glass, velvet, and whispered wealth. There were no blueprints on the tables, only minimalist art and abstract sculptures. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly sculpted smile, did not recognize me. She asked if I had an appointment. She did not call me a co-founder. She did not know that the very desk she sat at was paid for by the sweat of my early 20s. Before I could correct her, the glass doors to the inner sanctum swung open, and Gavin walked out. My husband, the man who had held my hand while the doctors told us my heart might simply stop. I took a breath, ready to step into his arms, ready to finally close the gap that my illness had forced between us. He stopped 2 feet away from me. He extended his right hand. I stared at his perfectly manicured fingers. He wanted a handshake. I looked up into his eyes, searching for the warmth of the man I married, but found only the flat, calculating gaze of a corporate stranger. His suit was bespoke, likely costing thousands of dollars, a far cry from the off-the-rack jackets we used to buy when we were scraping together payroll. I slowly raised my hand and accepted the handshake. His grip was brief, clinical, and completely devoid of affection. "Brianna," Gavin said, his voice loud enough to carry across the quiet lobby, sounding exactly as if he were addressing a minor retail shareholder who had shown up uninvited to an annual meeting. "You are looking well. We were not expecting you quite so early in the quarter." "I am completely cleared," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am ready to get back to work. Where is my team?" Gavin offered a thin, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. He slipped his hands into his pockets, a posture of absolute control. "We need to have a realistic conversation about your return. The landscape of the firm has shifted drastically over the last 36 months. We have pivoted our core strategy." "Pivoted away from the name we built?" I asked. "Rebranded," he corrected smoothly, his tone dripping with a condescension that made my newly healed heart beat a little faster. "We are playing in a different league now. And given your prolonged absence, we need to manage your reintegration carefully. I have been discussing this with the board. We are thinking of a legacy role for you." I felt the air thin out around me. A legacy role. Yes, Gavin continued, his voice slick and utterly shameless. A way to ease back in. To be perfectly honest, Brianna, there is no suitable position at the executive level right now. The pace is simply too punishing, and your health must remain the priority. We want you to focus on your recovery without the burden of operational oversight. He was using my illness as a weapon. He was wrapping my demotion in the velvet language of spousal concern. I did not scream. I did not cry. The corporate arena had taught me long ago that emotion is blood in the water, and Gavin was suddenly acting like a shark. If there is no executive role, I said softly, then who is sitting in my office? Gavin hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to know I had hit a nerve. He turned slightly, gesturing for me to walk with him down the main corridor. As we walked past the glass-walled executive suites, I looked at the corner office, my office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The frosted glass door bore a crisp new title, Lenora Wren, Executive Assistant to the CEO. I stopped walking. I stared at the name. Lenora Wren had been a junior assistant when I left for the hospital. Now, she was occupying the largest suite on the floor, second only to Gavin's. I had heard the whispers from a few old contacts during my recovery, rumors that Lenora had become the new brain of the company, the gatekeeper to Gavin, the woman who handled the silent, powerful mechanics of Meridian Harbor. Seeing her name etched into the glass of my domain solidified every dark, unspoken fear I had tried to ignore. Gavin did not stop to explain. He kept walking, leading me away from the executive wing entirely. He guided me past the plush conference rooms, past the quiet hum of the high-level analysts, and pushed open a heavy fire door that led to the third floor. The air here was instantly different. It was stale, lit by harsh fluorescent panels instead of custom ambient lighting. This was the back office, the engine room where the glamorous front of house never ventured. He led me to the far corner, a section I immediately recognized as vendor compliance. It was the department responsible for verifying subcontractor tax forms, chasing down late invoices, and filing menial paperwork. It was the lowest rung of the logistical ladder. Gavin stopped beside a cramped gray cubicle. The desk was pressed wood, chipped at the edges. A standard-issue desktop computer sat powered down in the center. "We thought this would be a low-stress environment for you to get your sea legs back," Gavin said, checking his heavy gold watch. "You can review the legacy subcontractor files. No deadlines, no pressure. Just take it one day at a time. I have a meeting with the investors in 10 minutes, so I will have someone from Human Resources bring you your login credentials." He gave me one last tight, meaningless smile, turned on his expensive leather heels, and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the compliance floor. I slowly lowered myself into the cheap office chair. It creaked under my weight. Through the gaps in the cubicle walls, I could see a few familiar faces, people I had hired, people whose mortgages were paid because of the business I built. I caught the eye of a senior data manager who had been with us for 5 years. Instead of smiling or waving, he immediately dropped his gaze to his keyboard, his shoulders tensing as he pretended he had not seen me. The silence of the floor was deafening. No one came over to welcome me back. No one asked how my heart was doing. I sat in that narrow, gray box, staring at the blank monitor, and let the cold, sharp truth wash over me. This was not marital distance. This was not a husband awkwardly trying to protect a sick wife from the stress of corporate life. Gavin pushing me down into a windowless cubicle while installing his young assistant in my corner office was a deliberate, calculated execution. He had taken the 36 months when I was fighting for my life, the months when I was too weak to read a financial statement or attend a board meeting, to orchestrate a systematic erasure of my existence in this company. He had dismantled my legacy, changed the locks, and painted over my name. He thought I was too broken to fight back. He thought I would sit in this cubicle, grateful for the crumbs of the empire I built, slowly fading into irrelevance. But as I sat there, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my healed heart beating against my ribs, I realized he had made a fatal miscalculation. I did not come back to be a legacy. I came back for what was mine. I spent the entire morning staring at a high-definition monitor that felt more like a polished gravestone than a tool for work. The compliance documents piled up on my pressed wood desk in a neat, insulting stack. It was a mountain of meaningless paper designed to keep me perfectly occupied and completely out of sight. I dragged my plastic mouse across the digital vendor logs, pretending to scrutinize the tax identification numbers, the routing codes, and the multi-page contractor agreements. My fingers typed rhythmically on the keyboard, mimicking the cadence of a diligent subordinate, but my eyes were actually tracking the digital footprint of the new regime. I navigated through the updated corporate intranet, diving deep into the public-facing directories and internal welcome packets. The company history page, once a proud testament to our shared struggle and sleepless nights, had been surgically altered. I clicked on the Executive Leadership tab. A massive, high-resolution portrait of my husband filled the screen, accompanied by a glossy, 5-paragraph biography that credited him as the sole, brilliant visionary behind the firm. My name had been completely scrubbed from the origin story. There was absolutely no mention of the woman who pawned her grandmother's vintage ring to secure our first terrible office lease. There was no trace of the partner who spent 70 hours a week structuring the entire operational framework. It was a masterclass in modern corporate gaslighting. I was a living ghost haunting a massive machine I had built with my own hands. Around 12 o'clock. The atmosphere on the floor shifted as the compliance staff began heading out for their mandated lunch breaks. I remained anchored in my gray box, the silence thick and heavy against my ears. A sudden shadow fell over the entrance of my cubicle. I looked up to see a senior accounts payable clerk, a quiet man who had been with our team since the very first year of operation. He glanced nervously over his left shoulder before dropping a thick manila folder onto my desk. He refused to make eye contact with me. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, hurried whisper. "He does not eat down here with the team anymore," the clerk said rapidly, his eyes darting toward the illuminated exit sign above the stairwell. "Do not bother looking for him in the main break room or the cafeteria. He only uses the private dining suite on the top floor now, every single day. Just him, a few key investors, and Lenora." Before I could even formulate a response, the clerk turned on his heel and hurried away, blending seamlessly back into the sea of gray partitions. I sat back in my cheap chair, the clerk's warning echoing in the sterile, conditioned air. A private dining suite, Lenora. The sheer audacity of it twisted something deep and primal inside my chest. I slowly looked down at the heavy canvas tote bag resting near my shoes. Inside that bag was an insulated thermal container I had meticulously packed at 6 o'clock this morning. It was a relic of a past life, a devoted reflex I had not yet managed to unlearn. During our first 5 years of building the business, the crushing stress had completely wrecked my husband's stomach. He suffered from severe acid reflux, the kind of violent illness that left him doubled over in agony, sweating through his shirts after a long day of brutal negotiations. I was the one who spent hours researching his strict medical diet. I was the one who sacrificed my rare free evenings pureeing vegetables, sourcing organic ingredients, and baking plain wheat bread so he could eat without pain. Today, out of some pathetic, lingering instinct of a caretaker, I had brought his safe, healing meal, low-sodium chicken broth, dry toasted wheat bread, and a small plastic container of freshly cut cantaloupe. It was a meal meant for a partner in the trenches, a quiet, invisible gesture of marital solidarity. Now, looking at the canvas bag, it felt like a heavy, humiliating joke. Yet, a cold, sharp, brilliant idea began to form in my mind. I reached down and picked up the thermal container. I told myself that even if the business was entirely stolen, even if the marriage was currently functioning as a hollow shell, there had to be some small residual fragment of shame left inside him. If I walked into that luxurious room and placed this deeply personal, undeniably domestic item directly in front of him, the polished corporate facade would have to fracture. It would force a massive glitch in his perfect, untouchable armor. It would force him to look the woman he was trying to bury right in the eyes. I stood up, walked away from the compliance floor, and took the elevator back up to the executive suite. The ascent was perfectly silent, the smooth hum of the modern machinery matching the steady, cold thrum of my pulse. I stepped out onto the plush, expensive carpet, gripping the plastic handle of the lunchbox so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The grand corridor was empty. The various assistants and junior executives were likely out for their own expensive lunches. I moved silently past the curated abstract art pieces and the heavy oak doors until I reached the very end of the hall. The private dining suite was enclosed by floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, an architectural choice designed to offer natural sunlight while obscuring the exact details of the high-stakes power lunches happening inside. But the expensive frosting was not entirely opaque. If you stood close enough to the surface, the blurred, colorful shapes sharpened into clearly recognizable figures. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the glass wall. The heavy soundproof wooden door was slightly ajar, just a tiny fraction of an inch, allowing a narrow sliver of unmuted sound and clear vision to escape into the quiet hallway. I held my breath, perfectly still, and looked directly through the gap. There were no wealthy investors in the room. There were no elite clients. It was just the two of them. They were sitting at the long, polished mahogany table, but they were not positioned across from each other in any professional capacity. They were sitting side by side, their leather chairs pulled so close together that their shoulders physically brushed. The physical space between them was entirely devoid of any standard workplace boundary. It was the casual, magnetic proximity of two people who had already mapped every single inch of each other. I watched in absolute silence as Lenora turned her body fully toward him. She raised her arms, her perfectly manicured fingers brushing lightly against the crisp collar of his expensive custom shirt. She was adjusting his silk tie. It was a slow, deliberate, incredibly intimate gesture. She smoothed the expensive fabric down his chest, her hand lingering over his heart for 3 long seconds. My husband did not pull away from her touch. He did not flinch or look around to see if anyone was watching. Instead, he leaned his weight into her hand, and then he smiled. It was not the tight, practiced smirk he used to manipulate board meetings. It was not the hollow, condescending expression he had weaponized against me down in the lobby earlier today. It was a soft, genuine, entirely relaxed smile. The corners of his eyes crinkled with obvious joy. It was a look of pure, unguarded comfort. It was the exact same smile he used to give me on lazy Sunday mornings, years ago, before the relentless ambition of this company consumed our entire lives. It was the distinct, unmistakable smile of a man who was deeply, unapologetically at home with the woman sitting next to him. The air in the hallway instantly turned to ice. The simple thermal container in my right hand suddenly felt like a heavy block of solid lead. The final, devastating pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. This was never just about a brutal change in corporate strategy. This was not a calculated business pivot designed to protect assets. I had spent the entire morning assuming my husband was simply a ruthless businessman who chose to sacrifice our marriage on the altar of his ambition. I had thought Lenora was simply a sharp, opportunistic assistant ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder over my sickbed. I was completely wrong. The betrayal was not confined to altered spreadsheets, hidden bank accounts, and secret board resolutions. It was absolute. It was total. They had not just taken my desk, my executive title, and my equity. They had stolen my entire life. They had built a brand new, gleaming kingdom right on top of the ashes of my physical suffering, and they were comfortably living in it together. The quiet humiliation I felt down in that tiny compliance cubicle vanished instantly, burned away by a sudden, terrifying surge of clarity. I was not standing outside a slightly awkward lunch meeting. I was standing at the dead center of a blast zone. The weak, hopeful woman who had spent 3 years fighting for air, fighting against the hospital monitors to return to her loving husband, died right there in that silent, luxurious corridor. What remained standing in her place was something entirely different. The sorrow evaporated from my blood, leaving nothing but cold, combustible, highly focused rage. I tightened my grip on the handle of the lunch container. I did not turn away and run to the elevators. I reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door wide open. The hinges of the heavy wooden door yielded without a single sound, a silent testament to the absurd amount of money recently poured into the architectural refinement of this executive sanctuary. As the thick barrier swung fully open, the narrow sliver of vision I had previously possessed expanded, revealing the magnificent, terrifying scope of the private dining suite. From the hallway, my line of sight had been restricted strictly to the intimate, suffocating bubble occupied by Gavin and his assistant. Now, fully crossing the threshold, I realized the stage was significantly larger, and the audience was far more important than I had initially anticipated. At the far end of an immense, custom-built mahogany table that stretched for at least 20 feet, bathed in the warm, ambient glow of a designer brass chandelier, sat a carefully curated assembly of power. There were 3 senior vice presidents whose faces I vaguely recognized from early investor prospectus drafts, alongside 2 sharply dressed external VIP clients. They were leaning back in their plush leather chairs, sipping sparkling water from heavy crystal glasses, casually reviewing thick, leather-bound financial portfolios. They were deliberately looking away, offering Gavin and his assistant the polite, wealthy illusion of absolute privacy while they waited for the main luncheon service to officially commence. I stepped fully into the room. My sensible, low-heeled shoes sank deeply into the obscenely thick, hand-woven wool rug, completely masking the sound of my approach. The air conditioning in this suite was kept at a crisp, sharp temperature, yet the atmosphere was heavy, saturated with the smell of roasted garlic, expensive truffle oil from the catered appetizers, and a sharp, overly sweet floral perfume that hit me immediately. It was certainly not a scent that belonged in a corporate boardroom. I walked the length of the room with the slow, impossibly measured cadence of a hunter navigating a field of dry brush. The internal restraint required to keep my hands from shaking, to keep my breathing perfectly even, was monumental. The 3 executives at the far end of the long table were the very first to notice the anomaly in their pristine environment. One of the external investors, a silver-haired man wearing an immaculate charcoal suit, frowned slightly. His brow furrowed in deep confusion as he registered the presence of a woman carrying a faded, unremarkable canvas tote bag into the most heavily guarded, exclusive sanctuary in the entire skyscraper. He opened his mouth, likely to summon security or alert my husband, but the sheer, glacial intensity radiating from my posture forced his mouth shut. He simply stared, entirely paralyzed by the wrongness of the scene unfolding before him. I reached the dead center of the long table. Gavin and Lenora were still utterly oblivious to my arrival. They were completely captivated by their own gravity. She was murmuring something low, teasing, and highly inappropriate for daylight hours, her manicured hand finally dropping from the silk fabric of his expensive tie to rest intimately, possessively, on his upper thigh just beneath the polished edge of the table. I did not scream. I did not hurl the canvas bag at his head or sweep the expensive crystal glasses onto the floor. Driven by a phantom marital muscle memory, a stubborn, pathetic ghost of the devoted, caretaking partner I had been for over a decade, I simply reached my right hand into the tote bag. I retrieved the insulated green thermal container I had packed in my kitchen at 6 o'clock that morning. With deliberate precision, I placed it squarely on the gleaming mahogany surface, positioning it exactly between Gavin's custom leather portfolio and Lenora's manicured hand. The dull, heavy thud of the hard plastic hitting the solid wood echoed like a deafening gunshot in the quiet room. Gavin flinched violently. His entire body jerked as if he had been struck by a physical electrical current. His head snapped up, the soft, unguarded, deeply affectionate smile that had been playing comfortably on his lips vanished so rapidly it looked as though it had been ripped from his face. The warm color instantly drained from his cheeks, his neck, and his forehead, leaving his skin the sickly, translucent shade of dirty parchment. He stared blindly at the green thermal container for 2 agonizing seconds, and then, with the slow, mechanical stiffness of a condemned man, he lifted his eyes to meet mine. He froze completely. He stopped breathing. The brilliant, ruthless chief executive officer, who had spent the last 36 months systematically dismantling my legacy, altering legal documents, and manipulating multi-million-dollar corporate assets, was reduced to a terrifying absolute paralysis by the simple sight of his own wife standing quietly in front of him. The atmosphere in the room plummeted to absolute zero. I completely ignored his rising panic. With the calm, methodical, and chilling precision of a trauma surgeon operating on a severed artery, I reached out and unfastened the 4 plastic latches securing the lid of the thermal container. A thin, delicate wisp of steam drifted up into the cold, conditioned air, carrying the simple, undeniably domestic scent of homemade, low-sodium chicken broth. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the bowl and slid it exactly 4 inches across the glossy wood, pushing it directly into Gavin's personal space. "You still should not eat food that is too spicy in the middle of the day," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, light, airy, and entirely stripped of any emotional tremor. It was the exact familiar tone of a loving spouse gently reminding her partner to manage his chronic acid reflux before a stressful afternoon of negotiations. Lenora, however, was entirely oblivious to the nuclear warhead currently detonating directly across from her. She let out a sharp, incredibly loud breath of sheer indignation. She leaned back against the expensive upholstery of her high-backed leather chair, defensively crossing her arms over her chest. She looked me slowly up and down, her eyes raking over my practical, unbranded clothing with the profound, unfiltered contempt of a woman who genuinely believed she held the absolute highest authority in the room. In her narrow, ambitious mind, she clearly assumed I was a confused courier, a lost vendor from the lower floors, or perhaps a mentally unstable logistical subordinate who had somehow bypassed the security desk. She thought she was the undisputed, invincible queen of this glass castle. She let out a harsh, mocking scoff, violently tossing her perfectly styled hair over her left shoulder. She desperately wanted to perform for the wealthy investors sitting in the shadows at the end of the table. She needed to assert her dominance, protect her territory, and publicly humiliate the bizarre intruder. She leaned forward, aggressively resting her elbows on the mahogany, and projected her voice so sharply that the sound waves bounced off the frosted glass walls, ensuring every single person in the suite would hear her perfectly. "Who's this to bring food to my lover?" she demanded, enunciating every single syllable with biting, theatrical arrogance. The word lover hung suspended in the chilled air, grotesque, heavy, and undeniably permanent. The silence that immediately followed her declaration was not merely the absence of noise, it was a crushing physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. The ambient, white noise hum of the ceiling ventilation system suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. At the far end of the long table, the polite, quiet breathing of the senior executives and external investors suffered a violent, immediate cessation. Nobody moved, nobody blinked. I did not turn my head to look at Lenora. I did not acknowledge her ridiculous, posturing question. Turning my attention to engage in a petty, verbal street fight with the mistress would have instantly elevated her to my level, and I was absolutely not going to grant her a single fraction of that honor. Instead, I kept my eyes locked entirely, unblinkingly, on Gavin. I waited for him to speak. I gave him 5 long, excruciatingly silent seconds to act like a man. I gave him an open window to interrupt, to scramble out of his chair, to offer some pathetic, desperate, convoluted lie to save his professional reputation in front of his most important financial backers. But he remained completely, devastatingly dead silent. He did not deny her absurd claim. He did not raise his voice to correct her bold, public declaration of their illicit affair. His jaw worked silently, opening and closing slightly, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single vibration. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his pale, sweating face confirmed to me, and to every single horrified spectator watching from the end of the table, that every dark suspicion I had harbored in the lobby was absolute reality. When it became painfully, tragically obvious that he had entirely lost the ability to defend himself, I tilted my head just a fraction of an inch to the right. "Are you not going to introduce her to your wife?" I asked. I kept my volume entirely conversational, almost pleasant, but the carefully chosen words sliced through the heavy, frozen atmosphere of the room like a freshly sharpened guillotine blade dropping from the ceiling. At the far end of the table, the reactions were immediate and chaotic. One of the VIP clients, a woman wearing a heavy silk blouse, jolted in her seat. The silver salad fork slipped from her fingers and struck her plate with a sharp clatter that broke the paralysis of the room. Beside her, one of the senior vice presidents slowly, deliberately reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulling out his smartphone and sliding it covertly onto his lap under the table. Only then did I finally allow my gaze to shift laterally, letting my eyes rest directly on Lenora's face. The physical transformation of her features was an absolute masterpiece of human panic. The smug, condescending sneer instantly evaporated into nothingness. Her lips parted in sheer, unadulterated horror as her brain finally processed the full reality of the situation. Her arrogant, territorial posture collapsed entirely inward. She darted a panicked, begging look toward Gavin, silently pleading with him to fix the nightmare, to tell the room it was a joke, but he was still staring at me like a corpse. Lenora's skin quickly turned a sickly, mottled shade of gray. The terrifying realization crashed down upon her in real time. In front of the most critical financial pillars of the entire company, she had just proudly and loudly claimed the chief executive officer as her sexual partner, while simultaneously insulting the legal spouse, the original co-founder, and the woman who still rightfully owned a massive percentage of the very floor they were sitting on. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to stammer out a pathetic apology, or to frantically backtrack her words, but I refused to give her the oxygen required to form a sentence. The execution was complete. The necessary damage was irrevocably inflicted. I smoothly reached out, picked up the green plastic lid, and placed it precisely back onto the container of soup. I pressed down heavily on the 4 latches, securing them with 4 sharp, distinct clicks that echoed across the long mahogany table. I picked the container up by its handle, dropped it casually back into the depths of my canvas tote bag, and turned sharply on my heel. I did not wait for an explanation. I did not stand there demanding tears, apologies, or a dramatic cinematic confrontation. I simply walked back toward the heavy wooden door with the exact same slow, measured, completely terrifying pace I had utilized to enter. The absolute suffocating silence of the ruined dining suite followed me the entire way out. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the heavy door shut behind me, the thick metal latch clicking firmly and securely into place. As I walked steadily toward the glowing elevator bank, my spine perfectly straight and my pulse finally beginning to race, I knew I was leaving behind a reputation explosion that was already beginning to spread downward through the floors, moving faster and burning hotter than any internal corporate email ever could. I left the skyscraper without looking back. The transition from the artificial chill of the executive floor to the heavy, humid Atlanta afternoon felt like crossing into a different dimension. I drove straight to the industrial district, navigating the labyrinth of repurposed warehouses until I reached the brick loft owned by my oldest friend, Tessa Rowan. Tessa did not ask questions when she opened her heavy steel door. She took one look at my face, locked the deadbolt behind me, and poured a heavy measure of bourbon into a glass. Sitting on Tessa's worn leather sofa, staring out at the fading skyline, I finally allowed my mind to catalog the events of the day without the suffocating filter of marital hope. For 3 long years, I had desperately clung to the narrative of a loving husband holding our empire together while I fought a failing heart. Sitting in the quiet safety of the loft, I stripped away that comforting lie. I forced myself to speak the true names of what had just happened. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a corporate pivot. It was absolute betrayal. It was systematic embezzlement. It was the deliberate, calculated erasure of my identity. It was a hostile takeover orchestrated from my own bedside. I needed a weapon, and I knew exactly who to call. Malcolm Raines had been the founding general counsel for Anchorbridge. He was a brilliant, deeply cynical corporate attorney who understood the mechanical architecture of our business better than anyone else. He had abruptly resigned over 2 years ago following a massive, closed-door screaming match with Gavin. I had been too sick at the time to intervene or even understand the context of their explosive fallout. Now the context was horrifyingly clear. I dialed Malcolm's private cell phone. He answered on the second ring. Within an hour, he was sitting across from me at Tessa's massive oak dining table, pulling a thick stack of printed financial filings from his battered leather briefcase. He looked older, his face lined with a grim, vindicated exhaustion. "I have been waiting for this phone call for over 24 months, Brianna," Malcolm said, sliding the first heavily redacted document across the polished wood. "I tried to warn you before I left, but you were in the intensive care unit, heavily medicated, and Gavin had already initiated a total communication blockade around your hospital room. He told the board your cognitive functions were impaired." I stared at the black ink on the page. "Show me the map, Malcolm. Show me exactly how he stole my company." Malcolm pulled a silver pen from his pocket and began tracing the dense legal paragraphs. "It started with a medical directive," he explained, his voice flat and devoid of pity. "During your second month in the hospital, when your heart failure was at its absolute worst and you were drifting in and out of consciousness on heavy narcotics, Gavin brought a notary into your room. He presented a document he claimed was a standard healthcare proxy to authorize emergency surgical procedures. You signed it. But buried in the addendums of that proxy was a comprehensive, irrevocable, durable power of attorney over all your corporate assets and voting rights." A cold, metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. I remembered the blinding white lights of the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the machines, and Gavin holding my trembling hand, guiding a pen across a clipboard while whispering that he would take care of everything. "Using that power of attorney," Malcolm continued, tapping the paper sharply, "he unilaterally convened a special board meeting. He bypassed the standard notice period by signing the waiver on your behalf. At that meeting, he amended the foundational bylaws of Anchorbridge. He authorized a massive internal issuance of new Class A voting shares." "A dilution," I whispered, the financial mathematics clicking instantly into place. "A slaughter," Malcolm corrected smoothly. "Before you went into the hospital, you held 55% of the controlling equity. You were the undisputed majority owner. Gavin held 30%, and the remaining 15% was distributed among early angel investors. The new share issuance flooded the capitalization table, because you supposedly waived your right of first refusal via the power of attorney. Gavin purchased the entirety of the new shares himself. He effectively diluted your ownership stake down to a pathetic 16%. He catapulted himself to absolute controlling dominance." I closed my eyes, feeling the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the theft. He had weaponized my failing organs to rewrite our corporate constitution. "And what about his assistant?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Lenora Wren. I saw her name on my old office door today." "I saw them together." Malcolm let out a harsh, humorless laugh, pulling a secondary file from his briefcase. "Lenora is not just an administrative assistant. Brianna. Gavin has structured her compensation package to look like she is a founding partner. He granted her a massive cache of performance units that convert to equity upon a liquidity event. She holds lucrative profit-sharing options. She has a dedicated company car, a black corporate expense card with no predefined limit, and most damning of all, she has been granted secondary signature authority on multiple high-yield disbursement schedules. She is functioning as a shadow executive, moving company capital at will." I looked at the documents outlining Lenora's extravagant corporate spoils. She was not just sleeping with my husband, she was actively looting my legacy. "There is a fatal flaw in his architecture, though," Malcolm said, leaning forward. the cynical lawyer replaced by a shark catching the scent of blood in the water. To execute the internal share issuance and dilute your 55%, Gavin had to actually purchase those new shares. We are talking about millions of dollars. Money he absolutely did not have in his personal liquid accounts. How did he fund the purchase? I asked, leaning in to match his intensity. He leveraged the company to buy the company, Malcolm replied, a dark, triumphant smile touching the corners of his mouth. I pulled the Uniform Commercial Code filings this morning. Gavin secured a massive personal loan to buy those shares, but the collateral he pledged for that loan was drawn directly against the operational credit line of Meridian Harbor. He used joint corporate assets to privately finance the theft of your equity. It is a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. It is corporate fraud. The puzzle was almost complete, but there was one final jagged piece I needed to understand. What about my work? The operational algorithms, the proprietary loss assessment framework, the commercial insurance negotiation models. I built all of those from scratch. Those systems are the only reason the company generates revenue. Malcolm pushed the final folder across the table. It contained glossy, beautifully designed investor pitch decks bearing the new Meridian Harbor logo. He stole that too. He stripped your name off every single piece of intellectual property. The entire valuation model you spent 4 years developing is now explicitly credited to Gavin and the newly formed office of the chief executive. He is currently pitching your genius to private equity firms in New York, claiming he single-handedly revolutionized commercial asset recovery during your tragic medical absence. I sat back against the leather sofa. The air in the loft was heavy with the weight of the revelations. A normal woman, a broken wife, would have immediately contacted a ruthless divorce attorney to fight over alimony, the marital home, and the division of shared checking accounts. But sitting there, looking at the meticulous map of my husband's treason, the concept of a standard divorce felt entirely inadequate. It felt like bringing a paper knife to a thermonuclear war. Gavin did not care about the marriage. He had proven that by bringing his mistress into my boardroom and letting her wear my authority like a cheap costume. The only thing Gavin truly worshipped, the only thing he valued above his own life, was the impenetrable power structure he had built and the massive cash flow it generated. If I simply filed for divorce, he would drag it through the family courts for a decade, hiding assets behind shell companies and using his stolen corporate wealth to bury me in legal fees. I realized, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that I could not strike at him as a wife. I had to strike at him as the rightful majority shareholder. I looked across the table at Malcolm. The exhaustion had entirely left my body, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused energy. "We are not filing a divorce petition," I said, my voice ringing with a deadly, absolute certainty in the quiet loft. "Not yet. If we hit his personal life, he will just retreat into the corporate fortress he built with my money. We are going to hit the fortress first." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over his legal pad. "Where do we start?" "We start by ripping the floorboards out from under his cash flow," I replied, pulling the investor pitch deck toward me. "We find the people he pushed out. We find the vendors he manipulated. We track every single dollar he moved through Lenora's hands. He thinks he managed a crisis. Malcolm, he is about to find out what a real crisis looks like." We transformed the expansive living area of the loft into a war room. The tall brick walls were soon covered in oversized sheets of thick white paper, and the heavy oak dining table vanished beneath towering stacks of printed litigation history, vendor contracts, and employment records. Malcolm and I were no longer just building a legal strategy. We were excavating a crime scene. To understand the exact anatomy of the takeover, we needed to speak with the ghosts of the old regime. We needed the people who had been systematically purged from the company roster the moment my hospital bed was wheeled into the intensive care unit. Our first target was Darius Flint, the former chief operating officer. We found him sitting in the corner booth of a dimly lit, fading diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, nursing a cup of black coffee. Darius was a man who used to command massive field logistics teams with flawless precision, But now he looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped beneath a heavy leather jacket. He slid a manila folder across the sticky laminate table before I even had the chance to sit down. "I knew you would come looking for this eventually," Darius said, his voice a low, bitter rumble. "Gavin fired me 4 months after you went on medical leave. He said my operational style was too archaic for the new corporate vision. But the truth is, I refused to play ball with his new preferred vendor network." Malcolm opened the folder, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense spreadsheets inside. I leaned over to look. "He gutted our entire trusted contractor list," Darius explained, tapping a blunt finger against the paper. "He replaced our seasoned crews with a handful of obscure, freshly incorporated companies. These new vendors charged utterly absurd emergency mobilization fees. I am talking about billing us $200,000 for rapid deployment units that never actually materialized on the disaster sites. The profit margins on paper looked absolutely spectacular, which pleased the board, but the actual quality of our recovery work plummeted. The transparency was completely gone." "Why did you approve these invoices, Darius?" I asked quietly. Darius let out a harsh breath, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small stack of printed emails. "Because he forced my hand. I have the digital correspondence right here. Gavin explicitly ordered me to sign off on these rapid deployment fees without any physical field verification. He threatened to terminate my pension if I pushed back." We left the diner with the printed emails secured in Malcolm's briefcase. Our next meeting was far more upscale, but the undercurrent of fear was identical. We met Felicity Boone, our former chief client officer, in the polished brass and velvet lounge of a downtown luxury hotel. Felicity was swirling a dry martini, her sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure we were not being watched. "The clients hate him," Felicity whispered, leaning closely across the small marble table. "They will not say it publicly because Meridian Harbor still holds their commercial insurance policies hostage, but behind closed doors, they are furious. Gavin instituted multi-layered consulting fees that completely baffled our oldest accounts." "Show me the mechanics of it," I said. Felicity unzipped her designer tote bag and handed me a meticulously organized binder. "These are the redlined service agreements for 3 of our largest coastal hotel clients. Notice the dates. The clients agreed to standard recovery percentages. But a week later, mysterious contract amendments would suddenly appear in the finalized legal packets, inflating our commission by an additional 15%. And every single time one of those phantom amendments materialized, Lenora was the one who had mysteriously intervened in the final round of negotiations." She pointed to the glaring discrepancies on the final pages. The numbers had been brazenly altered after the clients had already given verbal consent. It was textbook wire fraud, neatly disguised as aggressive corporate upselling. Our final puzzle piece was the most crucial and the most terrified. Nadine Foley had been our senior records manager, a quiet, brilliant woman who treated our digital archives like a sacred vault. We met her in the quiet, dusty aisles of the public library. Far away from the financial district, she kept twisting the strap of her purse, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit. "They demoted me to the basement data warehouse the week after your heart surgery," Nadine said, her voice trembling slightly. "Lenora told me my filing protocols were outdated. But down in the warehouse, I still had legacy administrative access to the central server nodes. They forgot to revoke my old security clearances." Malcolm leaned against the bookshelf, his arms crossed. "What did you find down there, Nadine?" "A graveyard," she replied, swallowing hard. "I was running a routine indexing script, and I accidentally stumbled into a hidden, encrypted subfolder on the executive drive. It was filled with hundreds of high-resolution scanned images of your signature. Brianna, just your signature, isolated on blank white backgrounds. Next to those files were the finalized board consent forms and the system access logs. The timestamps on the server logs had been manually scrubbed and overwritten. A cold chill radiated down my spine. They had not just manipulated my power of attorney, they had digitized my identity to forge documents whenever it suited their needs. "There is something else," Nadine whispered, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. I noticed a strange pattern in the logistics billing. There is a specific hauling company that receives priority dispatch on every single major disaster site, even though their submitted bids are always 30% higher than the market average. The company is called Wren Transit Support. The name hit me like a physical blow. Wren, Lenora Wren. I traced the corporate registration through the public records, Nadine continued, handing me the paper. It is registered to a holding company in Nevada, but the primary beneficiary is a trust controlled by Lenora's older brother. She is funneling massive amounts of our operational capital directly into her own family's bank accounts. We returned to the loft on after midnight. The city outside was quiet, but inside, the air was electric with undeniable proof. Malcolm stood before the largest piece of white paper on the wall. Holding a thick red marker, he began to draw the timeline. He marked the exact date of my hospitalization. A mere 48 hours later, Gavin initiated the corporate restructuring. 1 week after that, Lenora was elevated to the executive floor, and the mass firing of the old guard commenced. Within 30 days, Wren Transit Support and the other backyard vendors were fully integrated into the payroll system. And on the exact day I was transferred from the intensive care unit to the recovery ward, completely incapacitated by heavy sedatives, Gavin executed the internal share issuance that diluted my equity and stole my company. It was a masterpiece of absolute sociopathic efficiency. He had operated with the precise, cold-blooded calculation of a battlefield general executing a flawless ambush. I stood beside Malcolm, staring at the intricate web of deceit, fraud, and embezzlement mapped out on the brick wall. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking, but it also revealed their greatest vulnerability. A conspiracy of this magnitude required dozens of moving parts, forged documents, and digital trails that could never be entirely erased. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct sound broke the silence of the loft. It was the heavy metallic scrape of the mail slot on the front door being pushed open, followed by the soft thud of something hitting the hardwood floor. Malcolm and I exchanged a tense look. I walked swiftly to the entryway. Lying perfectly center on the polished wood was a plain, unmarked manila envelope. There was no postage, no return address, and no name written on the outside. Someone had physically bypassed the security gate downstairs and walked right up to the door. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the heavy paper. I tore the flap open and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. It was a highly classified, internal banking document, a direct wire transfer authorization form, dated just 2 days ago. It detailed a massive movement of capital, exactly $3.5 million, transferred from the primary operating account of Meridian Harbor into a blind intermediary shell company registered in Delaware. The authorization signature at the bottom belonged to Gavin, but the secondary approval initials, the ones required to release the funds, belonged to Lenora. I stared at the black ink, my heart hammering a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The document was an absolute smoking gun for corporate embezzlement. But more importantly, the existence of this envelope meant something entirely unexpected. We were not fighting this war alone. Deep inside the glass tower, surrounded by Gavin's new regime and Lenora's suffocating control, someone was quietly watching. Someone with high-level access to the most secure financial arteries of the company had decided to break rank. Someone inside the fortress was secretly, dangerously standing with me. The counteroffensive did not begin with a subpoena. It began with a glossy, highly curated spread in one of the most prominent financial magazines on the East Coast. Malcolm dropped the freshly printed issue onto the dining table. The cover featured a brooding, professionally lit photograph of Gavin standing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new executive suite. The headline was designed to evoke maximum corporate sympathy. It framed him as the ultimate modern martyr, a visionary who had single-handedly navigated a rapidly expanding firm while heroically carrying the heavy, tragic burden of a physically and mentally fragile wife. The article painted my absence not as a medical emergency, but as a tragic, lingering breakdown. He used words like unstable, overwhelmed, and delicate to describe me. He carefully built a public narrative that justified his total usurpation of my authority. He was not a thief. He was a dutiful caretaker stepping up to save the family legacy from a woman too weak to hold it. Simultaneously, Lenora launched her own digital campaign. Her professional social media profiles were suddenly flooded with highly stylized, impeccably filtered photographs of herself directing operations from my former office. She posted images of catered board lunches and late-night strategy sessions, accompanied by carefully crafted captions. She used phrases like feeling incredibly grateful, building stronger than ever, and steering the ship into the future. It was a perfectly synchronized, subtle public execution. Every post, every interview, was a deliberate brick in a new wall designed to box me into the past. When the smear campaign began gaining traction within our broader industry circles, Gavin decided to escalate his tactics from the boardroom to my personal life. My son, Noah, was 7 years old. During my prolonged hospitalization, Gavin had outsourced his care entirely to a rotating staff of expensive nannies. Now that I was fully recovered and had moved Noah out of the house into a secure, leased townhouse under my own name, Gavin saw an opportunity to manufacture a domestic crisis. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly at 3:30, my phone vibrated with an urgent alert from the director of Noah's after-school science program. Gavin had unexpectedly arrived at the facility with a private photographer loitering near his luxury sedan. He was loudly demanding to sign Noah out early, putting on a highly visible performance of a loving, desperately concerned father being cruelly alienated from his only child by an erratic, runaway mother. He wanted me to rush to the school. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to create a hysterical public scene that his hired photographer could capture and leak to the press to solidify his narrative of my supposed mental instability. I did not give him the satisfaction of a public meltdown. I did not even leave the loft. Instead, I sat perfectly still at Malcolm's makeshift command center and called my elite family law attorney. Within exactly 45 minutes, a courier delivered a court-stamped emergency ex parte order directly to the after-school director. The document legally restricted pickup authorization exclusively to myself and Tessa. It was executed with cold, flawless, administrative precision. When Gavin realized there would be no screaming match, no tears, and no usable photographs, he was forced to retreat back to his car in humiliated silence. I denied him the spectacle he desperately craved. While Gavin wasted his energy trying to provoke a messy domestic dispute, I focused entirely on severing his financial lifelines. Malcolm had spent the previous 48 hours establishing a brand new, impeccably clean legal entity named Kendrick Resolution Lab. We did not lease a flashy office or print glossy brochures. We operated completely in the shadows, armed with the damning, red-lined contracts Felicity had smuggled out. I began discreetly contacting the most lucrative, foundational clients of Meridian Harbor. I did not approach them with desperate, emotional pleas about my stolen company. I did not badmouth my husband or mention his affair. Corporate executives do not care about marital drama. They care about their profit margins and their legal liabilities. Instead, I sent them highly sanitized, fiercely analytical independent audits of their recent billing cycles. I highlighted the exact, multi-layered consulting fees Gavin had artificially inflated. I mapped out the obscure subcontractor networks, specifically pinpointing the exorbitant, unjustified invoices routed through Ren Transit support. Along with the hard data, I attached a quiet, legally bulletproof roadmap detailing exactly how they could safely transition their accounts to my new firm without triggering the aggressive penalty clauses Gavin had buried in their amended contracts. The strategy was a surgical strike against his credibility. The first massive tremor hit his empire on a Thursday morning. A massive coastal hospitality conglomerate, a client that accounted for nearly 18% of Meridian Harbor's annual revenue, abruptly halted their multi-million-dollar contract renewal. Their general counsel sent a brutally short email to Gavin's executive team, stating they were initiating an immediate, comprehensive internal review of all historical vendor disbursements before signing any future agreements. The financial shockwave was instantaneous. The sheer panic it caused on the executive floor must have been absolutely intoxicating. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my personal cell phone rang. The caller identification displayed a restricted, untraceable number. I answered it, placing the device carefully on the wooden table so Malcolm could hear the audio. "You need to stop this immediately," Gavin said. His voice was completely stripped of the slick, polished arrogance he had displayed in the magazine interview. He sounded breathless, erratic, and deeply afraid. The polite, corporate facade had violently fractured. "Stop what, Gavin?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "I am simply running an independent consultancy. The free market is highly competitive. Do not play these games with me, Brianna," he hissed, his words dripping with pure venom. "I know exactly what you are doing with the coastal accounts. You are trying to trigger a breach of contract cascade, but you are going to call them tomorrow morning and retract everything. You are going to tell them your numbers were flawed." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "And why would I do that? Because if you do not back down, I will destroy whatever is left of you," he threatened, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural pitch. "Do you think I did not keep records of your worst days? I have hours of video from your first month home from the hospital. I have footage of you crying on the floor, incapable of holding a glass of water, heavily medicated and completely incoherent. I have the audio recordings of your panic attacks. If you touch my clients again, I will release every single file to the board, to the industry blogs, and to the family court judge. I will prove to the entire world that you are completely medically unstable. You will never run a company again, and you will certainly never get custody of Noah." He was panting heavily by the time he finished his ultimatum. He genuinely believed he held the ultimate trump card. He thought the shame of my physical illness would force me into submission. I looked across the table at Malcolm. The veteran attorney did not say a word, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, triumphant fire. Gavin had just committed federal extortion over a recorded interstate telecommunications line. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Gavin hesitated, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of panic. "I am giving you 24 hours to fix the hotel account, Brianna, or I burn you to the ground." "You made a critical error, Gavin," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute lethal certainty. "You thought my silence meant I was weak. You thought my illness made me stupid. But you just threatened the two things I will defend with my life, my son, and my legacy." I disconnected the call before he could utter another word. The threat was meant to paralyze me with fear, to send me running back to the shadows. But as I sat there, staring at the darkened screen of the phone, I felt nothing but an absolute, unbreakable resolve. The era of quiet maneuvering and subtle client negotiations was officially over. He wanted to use my medical history to destroy my future. He wanted to drag my suffering into the public square. I picked up the black pen resting on the table and looked at Malcolm. "Prepare the emergency injunctions," I ordered, my voice hard as steel. "Draft the demands for the server logs, the forensic accounting of his credit lines, and the temporary restraining orders regarding my medical records. We are not just taking the clients anymore. We are taking the entire board of directors." The breakthrough arrived at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, delivered on a small, encrypted solid-state drive that felt heavier than a brick of solid gold. Nadine had taken a terrifying risk. While Gavin had spent millions of dollars polishing the front-facing aesthetic of Meridian Harbor, his profound arrogance had left the digital foundation dangerously neglected. When he initiated the hostile rebranding, he ordered the Information Technology Department to migrate all active files to a new, cloud-based server. However, he was entirely too lazy to authorize the systematic destruction of the old Anchor Bridge legacy systems. The physical backup servers were simply unplugged from the main network and left entirely unsecured in the basement data warehouse. Nadine, utilizing an obsolete authentication token that no one had bothered to revoke, had quietly plugged a bypass terminal directly into the dusty hardware. She spent 4 agonizing hours extracting every single deleted file, hidden directory, and cached communication log that Gavin assumed was buried forever. We plugged the drive into a secure offline terminal Malcolm had set up in the center of the loft. We had brought in an independent digital forensics expert, a silent, meticulous man who immediately went to work breaking down the encrypted partitions. The first layer we breached was the raw, unedited general ledger for the previous 24 months. It was a masterclass in corporate gluttony. Gavin and his newly appointed chief financial officer, Bryce Calder, had aggressively categorized massive personal expenditures under an obscure accounting code labeled as client cultivation. I scrolled through the decoded spreadsheets, my eyes tracing the staggering amounts of embezzled capital. There was a wire transfer of $85,000 for a private chartered flight to a luxury resort in the Caribbean. There was an invoice for $42,000 routed to a high-end interior design firm to furnish a private downtown penthouse. There were recurring monthly charges of $12,000 for an exclusive country club membership. Not a single one of these expenses was attached to a legitimate revenue-generating client account. He was violently bleeding the company dry to fund his illicit, extravagant life with Lenora. But the stolen money was merely the prologue. The true horror of their conspiracy was buried in a restricted subfolder labeled simply as Administrative Templates. The forensic expert clicked the mouse, opening a grid of high-resolution image files. The breath caught painfully in my throat. Staring back at me were dozens of isolated, digitally manipulated scans of my own signature. They had taken a legitimate contract I had signed years ago and run it through advanced vector software. "Look at the internal metadata notes attached to the image files," Malcolm instructed, his voice tight with barely contained fury. I leaned closer to the monitor. Attached to a specific variant of my signature was a short, chilling text directive sent directly from Lenora's internal messaging account to an outsourced graphic designer. The message read, "Make sure the pen strokes look authentic. Add a slight tremor to the tail of the letters. It needs to look like the shaky strokes of someone who is still in the middle of a heavy medical recovery." They had actively engineered the physical symptoms of my heart failure into the forged documents to ensure the board of directors would not question the erratic handwriting. The sheer, cold-blooded sociopathy required to weaponize my physical trauma was staggering. "We have something worse," the forensic expert said quietly, stepping back from the keyboard and gesturing toward the screen. I managed to recover a deleted, cached audio file from the local hard drive of the chief financial officer. It looks like an automatic local recording of an executive conference call that took place approximately 18 months ago. He pressed the spacebar to initiate the playback. The crisp, digitized audio filled the quiet confines of the loft. "The board is getting anxious about her prolonged absence," Bryce Calder's voice echoed through the speakers, sounding deeply nervous. "If she demands an external audit of the equity structure when she returns, we are entirely exposed on the share dilution. The bylaws require her direct, conscious approval." "She is not going to demand anything," Gavin's voice responded, dripping with arrogant, dismissive confidence. "We are going to control the entire narrative. When she finally wakes up and realizes what happened, she will be hysterical. We need the narrative to be that she is mentally unstable. We frame the dilution as an emergency, protective measure to save the firm from her cognitive decline." "And the system access logs?" Bryce asked, his voice trembling. "The internal timestamps clearly show the proxy approvals were executed from this building." Lenora's voice cut through the audio, sharp, commanding, and utterly ruthless. "Then you clean the logs, Bryce. You scrub the executive terminal history, and you manually backdate the proxy authorizations. Do it tonight." The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, toxic silence in its wake. Gavin had threatened to destroy my reputation with claims of mental instability, but I now possessed the absolute, undeniable proof that my supposed insanity was nothing more than a carefully fabricated corporate strategy. "This is a federal crime," Malcolm stated, pulling a fresh legal pad across the table. Conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and the deliberate destruction of corporate financial records. But we need to make the timeline entirely bulletproof. The forensic expert nodded, pulling up a complex string of numbers. I already cross-referenced the network routing data. The emails containing the final, authorized board consents that stripped you of your controlling equity were routed through a specific internal local area network address. That address belongs exclusively to the secure router on the 42nd floor of the corporate headquarters. I have the exact timestamps down to the second. I pulled my personal medical binder from my briefcase and opened it to the hospital discharge summaries. "Match the dates," I ordered. Malcolm dragged his finger across the forensic report, reading the date of the proxy execution. The 17th of October, exactly at 10:30 in the morning. I looked down at the heavy embossed hospital records. On the morning of the 17th of October, my lungs were actively filling with fluid. I was heavily sedated, intubated, and physically restrained to a bed in the cardiac intensive care unit on the opposite side of the city. There is a 0% chance I was standing on the 42nd floor of my office authorizing a hostile dilution of my own shares. We had the murder weapon. We had the fingerprints. Now, I needed to completely neutralize the blackmail material Gavin intended to use against me. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, I did not go to a lawyer. I went to the hospital. I sat in the sterile, brightly lit office of my primary cardiologist, and then I drove across town to the private clinic of my licensed clinical therapist. I did not ask for their sympathy. I demanded their absolute clinical authority. By noon, I held 2 sworn, notarized medical affidavits in my hands. The first document comprehensively detailed my absolute physical incapacitation during the specific dates the forged corporate documents were executed. The second document was a rigorous, contemporary psychological evaluation, confirming with absolute medical certainty that my cognitive functions were flawless. My judgment was entirely sound, and I possessed 0 underlying psychiatric instability. I refused to allow Gavin to monopolize the story of my health. I had captured the truth and locked it in legal cement. Armed with the forensics and the medical affidavits, I authorized Malcolm to move forward. Within 2 hours, our newly hired litigation team filed a barrage of emergency, sealed motions in the federal district court. We filed a terrifyingly strict ex parte injunction, legally prohibiting Gavin, Lenora, or any entity affiliated with Meridian Harbor from disseminating, discussing, or weaponizing any of my private medical records or personal media. Any violation would result in immediate, severe criminal contempt charges. Simultaneously, we secured a comprehensive spoliation order, legally freezing every single server, hard drive, and mobile device connected to the executive team. Finally, we submitted a formal, legally binding demand to the board of directors for an immediate, third-party forensic audit of the corporate treasury. The trap was entirely set. The legal perimeter was secured. We were simply waiting for the inevitable explosion. At exactly 10 o'clock that night, Malcolm's encrypted cellular phone vibrated aggressively on the wooden table. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the brief, incoming text message. A slow, predatory smile spread across his tired face. He turned the screen toward me. The message was sent from an untraceable burner number, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was from Arthur Sterling, the most senior, fiercely independent member of the Meridian Harbor Board of Directors. He was a ruthless, traditional investor who had mentored me during the early days of Anchor Bridge, a man who valued profit deeply but despised sloppy corporate liability even more. The message contained only 2 sentences. "Gavin just called an emergency board session for tomorrow morning to push you out permanently. If you walk into that room with the original, unedited proof, I will give you everything you need to take him down." The emergency session of the board of directors convened precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning in the grand, glass-enclosed boardroom on the top floor of the Meridian Harbor Tower. The space was designed to intimidate, featuring panoramic views of the entire city skyline, a massive, custom-built table carved from a single slab of dark walnut, and heavy leather chairs that cost more than most people earned in a month. Gavin sat at the absolute head of the table. He had arranged the seating chart strategically, placing himself and his loyal chief financial officer, Bryce Calder, near the presentation screens, while leaving a single, isolated chair near the door for me. His intention was glaringly obvious. He wanted to visually and spatially frame me as an outsider, a disgruntled, irrational minority shareholder who was actively attempting to sabotage the company out of petty emotional vindictiveness. I did not sit in the chair by the door. I walked into the room wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal gray suit, the kind of armor I used to wear when negotiating multi-million-dollar disaster recovery contracts before my heart failed. I did not walk in looking like a betrayed wife seeking an apology. I walked in like the original architect of the entire business model, returning to inspect a deeply flawed structural renovation. Malcolm walked closely beside me, carrying a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase. I bypassed the isolated chair entirely and took a seat directly across the center of the table, forcing Gavin to physically turn his head to look at me. Gavin stood up, adjusting his silk tie, projecting an aura of weary, burdened leadership. He looked around the table at the 6 voting members of the board. "Gentlemen," Gavin began, his voice dripping with practiced, sorrowful resonance. "I called this emergency session today because we are facing an unprecedented internal crisis. As you are all aware, my wife has recently returned from a prolonged, 3-year medical absence. Unfortunately, she is struggling to adapt to the modernized reality of our firm. She has begun actively harassing our foundational clients and disrupting our daily operations. We are here to formalize a protective injunction to isolate her minority shares, ensuring her personal, emotional instability does not destroy the incredible valuation we have built." He sat down, looking extremely satisfied with his opening statement. He expected me to shout, to cry, to validate his carefully constructed narrative of female hysteria. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look at him. I looked directly at Arthur Sterling, the senior independent board member who had secretly messaged us the night before. "We are not here to discuss my marriage," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority in the quiet room. "And we are certainly not here to discuss my health. We are here to address a systematic, multi-year conspiracy of corporate fraud, gross embezzlement, and a calculated breach of fiduciary duty executed by the chief executive officer sitting at the head of this table." Before the murmurs of shock could even ripple through the room, Malcolm opened his briefcase. He did not use a digital projector. He wanted the physical weight of the evidence to hit the table. He distributed 6 thick, heavily indexed binders, sliding one directly in front of each board member. "Turn to tab 1, Malcolm instructed, his tone shifting into the ruthless cadence of a seasoned prosecutor. "You will find 2 sworn, notarized medical affidavits from Mrs. Kendrick's primary cardiologist and her licensed clinical therapist. They categorically confirm she possesses 0 cognitive impairment. The narrative of her mental instability is a deliberate, fabricated lie." Malcolm paced slowly behind my chair. "Now, turn to tab 2, the medical power of attorney. Gavin Holloway utilized this document to bypass the standard notice period and unilaterally authorize the issuance of new Class A voting shares, intentionally diluting my client's controlling equity from 55% down to 16%. He claimed she provided verbal consent." Malcolm pulled out a large printed spreadsheet featuring the network routing data Nadine had extracted from the basement servers. "This is the undeniable digital forensics report," Malcolm continued, tapping the paper sharply. "The final, authorized board consents that stripped her equity were digitally signed and transmitted from a secure local area network router located on the 42nd floor of this exact building. The timestamp is 10:30 in the morning on the 17th of October. If you refer back to the medical affidavits in tab 1, you will see that at that exact minute, Mrs. Kendrick was heavily sedated, intubated, and physically restrained to a bed in a cardiac intensive care unit on the opposite side of the city. The digital signatures are absolute, provable forgeries. The atmosphere in the boardroom instantly turned suffocating. Several board members stopped breathing. Bryce Calder, sitting to the left of Gavin, turned the color of wet ash. "It does not stop at equity theft," Malcolm said, driving the blade deeper. "Turn to tab 3, the vendor contracts. You will see a detailed financial routing map connecting Meridian Harbor to an obscure logistics provider named Wren Transit Support. This vendor charges 30% above market rates and is directly controlled by a family trust belonging to Lenora Wren, the executive assistant currently sitting in the corner of this room. Furthermore, tab 4 outlines massive, unauthorized treasury disbursements categorized as client cultivation, which were actually utilized to fund private Caribbean flights and penthouse interior design for the chief executive officer. Gavin slammed his open hand violently against the walnut table. The sharp crack echoed through the room. His polished facade was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered panic. "This is an absolute fabrication," Gavin shouted, his face flushing dark red. "Every single decision I made, every structural pivot and vendor replacement, was executed to save this company from total bankruptcy while you were incapacitated. I protected the operational cash flow. I carried the entire weight of this firm." Malcolm did not argue. He did not engage in a shouting match. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and placed a small, wireless speaker directly in the center of the table. He pressed a single button on his screen. The crisp, unedited, recovered audio file filled the boardroom. The board members listened in absolute horrified silence as the digitized voice of Bryce Calder worried about the system access logs. They listened as Gavin arrogantly detailed his plan to frame me as mentally unstable to justify the hostile dilution. And finally, they listened to the sharp, commanding voice of Lenora Wren explicitly ordering the chief financial officer to manually scrub the executive terminal history and backdate the proxy authorizations. The audio file ended. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Lenora, who had been sitting quietly in a secondary chair behind Gavin, completely lost her mind. The sheer, crushing reality of federal prison suddenly materialized in front of her. She leaped out of her chair, her hands shaking violently. "You are obsessed!" Lenora screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, entirely abandoning any pretense of corporate professionalism. "You could not just let it go. You had to come back and ruin everything." She spun around, her panic transforming into vicious, desperate betrayal as she looked at Gavin. "You promised me," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You looked me in the eyes and promised me she would never come back. You swore you had her legally locked out permanently. You said the company was ours." She clamped her hands over her mouth a second too late. In her hysterical attempt to defend herself, she had just explicitly, undeniably confirmed their illicit relationship, their premeditated conspiracy, and her active role in the usurpation of my authority in front of the entire voting board. Arthur Sterling did not wait another second. He leaned forward, closing his binder with a heavy, definitive thud. "I have heard absolutely enough," Arthur stated, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "I am calling for an immediate, emergency vote. The motion on the floor is to instantly hire an external, independent forensic accounting firm to audit the entire Treasury. Furthermore, effective immediately, we are freezing all major expenditure signature authority and operational control currently held by Gavin Holloway and Bryce Calder pending the final results of the federal investigation." Gavin looked entirely shell-shocked. He turned his desperate gaze toward an older, silent investor sitting at the end of the table. This investor had been Gavin's strongest ally during the rebranding phase, the man who had heavily funded the new, glossy vision of Meridian Harbor. Gavin silently pleaded with him to block the motion. The older investor looked down at the original metadata logs. He looked at the forged signatures. He looked at the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud. He was a ruthless capitalist, but he was not a fool. He knew that protecting Gavin now meant becoming a legal accessory to massive corporate crimes. To save himself from the impending blast radius, he had to cut the dead weight. He slowly raised his right hand into the air. "I second the motion," the older investor said quietly. The vote was unanimous. Within exactly 3 minutes, the grand empire Gavin had spent 3 years stealing was effectively paralyzed. He was stripped of his checkbook, his authority, and his protective shield. The boardroom gavel fell, not with a loud crack, but with a silent, devastating shift in absolute power. As the meeting formally adjourned and the board members quickly filed out of the room to distance themselves from the wreckage, I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. I did not look back at my husband. Malcolm walked beside me toward the glass elevators. Just as the doors slid open, his phone vibrated softly in his hand. He glanced at the illuminated screen, his eyebrows raising slightly in pure, cynical amusement. He tilted the screen so I could read the incoming text message. It was from Lenora Wren. The message read, "I need to meet with you privately tonight. I will tell you where Bryce hid the rest of the offshore routing numbers if you guarantee me a lighter settlement." The fortress had not just been breached. The people inside were already starting to eat each other alive. The meeting with Lenora did not happen in a sophisticated corporate setting or a high-end restaurant. Malcolm arranged it at 2 o'clock in the morning in the stark, fluorescent-lit booth of a 24-hour diner situated just off the interstate, miles away from the financial district. I sat in the driver's seat of Malcolm's sedan, parked in the shadows across the street, watching through the rain-streaked windshield. I did not need to be at the table. My presence would only make her defensive. Malcolm needed her terrified, calculating, and entirely focused on self-preservation. Lenora did not come to that diner out of any sudden moral awakening or lingering remorse. She came because the survival instincts of a seasoned opportunist had finally kicked in. When the board of directors froze Gavin out, she realized with crystal clarity that she was perfectly positioned to be the ultimate scapegoat. Gavin had insulated himself behind layers of executive privilege, but Lenora's name was on the vendor contracts. Her family trust was the recipient of the embezzled funds. She knew Gavin would happily throw her to the federal prosecutors to shave a decade off his own sentence. She slid a thick, waterproof envelope across the sticky table to Malcolm in exchange for a written promise that our legal team would advocate for a plea agreement rather than maximum consecutive sentences. When Malcolm returned to the car and opened the envelope, the sheer volume of the betrayal was staggering. Lenora had provided the original, unredacted shadow bonus agreement Gavin had drafted for her. It was a legally binding promise of equity, completely bypassing board approval. She handed over the raw wire transfer instructions that Bryce Calder had personally prepared to funnel our operational capital into her offshore accounts. But the most devastating piece of ammunition was a printed transcript of encrypted text messages between her and Gavin, dated during my second week in the cardiac ward. One specific message from Gavin stood out in stark, black ink. "Keep the board distracted with her medical updates. As soon as I formally push her out and dilute the remaining shares, I will transfer the final 20% into your Nevada trust. We will have complete control by the end of the fiscal year." He had not just stolen the company, he had packaged my life's work as a romantic gift to his mistress. Armed with Lenora's defection, Malcolm did not wait for the sun to rise. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, he forwarded a heavily redacted copy of the text messages and the wire instructions directly to the personal defense attorney representing Bryce Calder. The message was simple and brutally effective. "Lenora has already turned state's evidence, and you are currently holding the bag for massive corporate wire fraud." Bryce Calder, a man who had spent his entire life managing risk, took exactly 4 hours to fold. Facing the terrifying prospect of bearing the sole criminal liability for a conspiracy he did not even orchestrate, Bryce abandoned his loyalty to Gavin. By noon, Bryce's attorney formally submitted the pristine, unaltered master server logs to our legal team. These logs contained the immutable, unchangeable digital fingerprints, proving that Gavin explicitly ordered the deletion of the original proxy authorizations and directed the manual backdating of the equity transfer. Every single lie Gavin had constructed was now systematically dismantled by his own closest allies. The walls of the fortress were not just cracking, they were actively collapsing inward. Aware that his executive shield was gone and his co-conspirators had flipped, Gavin launched one final, desperate counterattack. A courier arrived at the loft, carrying a massive, heavily bound legal settlement offer from Gavin's elite crisis management firm. Malcolm read the numbers aloud, his voice thick with cynical disbelief. Gavin was offering me $35 million in clean, untraceable liquid assets, a guaranteed, uncontested divorce with full custody of Noah, and the immediate transfer of the family estate. It was a staggering amount of wealth, enough to disappear and live in absolute luxury for the rest of my life. But the stipulations attached to the money were absolute poison. To accept the funds, I had to sign a lifetime, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. I had to withdraw all civil and federal complaints immediately. Most repulsively, I had to issue a joint, public press release stating that all structural changes at Meridian Harbor, including my demotion and the dilution of my equity, were completely voluntary decisions made to accommodate my fragile health. He wanted to buy his innocence. He wanted me to permanently cement the lie that I was too weak to lead. I did not even pick up a pen. I told Malcolm to throw the entire binder into the trash. Instead of negotiating, I executed a move Gavin never anticipated because his entire strategy relied on my inherent sense of shame. He believed I would do anything to keep the messy, painful details of my physical collapse hidden from the corporate world. He had constantly threatened to weaponize my medical trauma against me, so I took his weapon away. I instructed Malcolm to file my complete, unsealed medical records, the psychiatric evaluations, and the timeline of my recovery directly into the public court docket as part of our civil lawsuit. I voluntarily exposed my darkest, most vulnerable days to the entire world. I attached sworn statements detailing exactly how I was physically restrained to a hospital bed while my husband forged my signature. The resulting media explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The financial publications that had previously printed Gavin's polished, heroic narrative completely turned on him. The narrative flipped overnight. The corporate world no longer saw an unstable, hysterical wife causing trouble for a visionary leader. They saw a brilliant, foundational architect who had been ruthlessly exploited, defrauded, and robbed at the absolute lowest moment of her life. The public humiliation Gavin had tried to reserve for me engulfed him completely. Panic set in. With the narrative destroyed and his allies gone, Gavin's actions became entirely erratic. He attempted to circumvent the family court orders by sending a hired private investigator to Noah's after-school program to pass a message to my son, a desperate attempt to manipulate Noah's affections. The school security, strictly enforcing my previous injunction, immediately called the police, and the investigator was escorted off the premises in handcuffs. Hours later, the forensic accountants appointed by the board notified us that Gavin had attempted to execute an emergency wire transfer of $2 million from a hidden contingency fund routed through the Cayman Islands. He was trying to secure cash for a legal defense, or perhaps a sudden disappearance, but the federal freeze Malcolm had established was completely impenetrable. The bank compliance officers flatly denied the transaction and flagged his accounts for international money laundering. Every single door he tried to open was already locked and welded shut. The morning of the federal hearing finally arrived. The air in the city was crisp, cold, and undeniably clear. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom of my new townhouse. I did not wear the soft, accommodating colors I used to wear when trying to balance my role as a supportive wife and a corporate partner. I put on a sharply tailored, minimalist black suit. It was armor-stripped of all pretense. I smoothed the fabric over my shoulders, feeling the steady, unbroken rhythm of my fully healed heart beating against my ribs. When I stepped out of the hired car and looked up at the towering marble steps of the federal courthouse, a massive crowd of financial reporters and photographers surged against the barricades. Flashbulbs erupted like a thunderstorm. For 3 years, I had lived in the terrifying shadow of a man who tried to erase my existence. But as I began my ascent up those heavy stone steps, with Malcolm walking firmly beside me carrying the undeniable proof of our victory, I felt no fear. I was not walking into that courtroom to ask for my job back, or to beg for a financial settlement. I was walking in to bring down an empire built entirely on lies. The federal courtroom was completely devoid of the emotional theatrics Gavin had likely prepared for. Malcolm built our case on a distinctly American, ruthlessly pragmatic foundation. He did not ask me to take the stand and weep about my broken marriage. He did not paint me as a victim of a tragic romance. Instead, he systematically buried my husband under an avalanche of undeniable forensic mathematics. He laid out the timeline using forged signatures, altered server timestamps, offshore wire instructions, and perfectly corroborated cross-examinations. It was a sterile, surgical dismantling of a corporate heist. Bryce Calder was the very first pillar to collapse under oath. The former chief financial officer sat in the witness box, sweating heavily through his expensive custom collar, desperate to secure his immunity deal. When Malcolm pressed him on the financing of the internal stock issuance, Bryce cracked wide open. He admitted, in a shaky but clearly audible voice, that Gavin had explicitly ordered him to draw against the operational credit line of the company to artificially generate the capital required to buy the newly issued voting shares. He confirmed to the federal judge that the entire dilution of my equity, dropping my ownership from 55% down to 16%, was an illegal, deeply fraudulent manipulation of corporate funds. Then, Lenora Wren took the stand. She had abandoned her designer corporate wardrobe for a plain, conservative blouse, attempting to project the image of a naive, manipulated subordinate. Her entire strategy was focused on self-preservation. However, in her frantic desperation to prove she was merely following Gavin's terrifying orders, she completely destroyed him. Malcolm asked her about the medical narrative Gavin had pushed to the board of directors. Lenora gripped the microphone and practically screamed her answer. "He promised me," Lenora testified, her voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls. "He said he would make Brianna look completely crazy to the court and the market. He said we had to use her hospital stay to take the company, and he would use her mental state to keep full custody of their son." The word crazy hung in the silent courtroom, completely shattering Gavin's carefully constructed public image of a concerned, burdened caretaker. By trying to save herself, Lenora had essentially handed the federal prosecutor a signed confession of premeditated extortion. When it was Gavin's turn, his highly paid defense attorney attempted a frantic, last-minute pivot. He tried to argue that Gavin was a visionary executive who had been tragically deceived by a rogue assistant and an incompetent financial officer. He tried to claim Gavin had absolutely no knowledge of the forged signatures or the scrubbed digital logs, but Malcolm did not even let the lie breathe in the room. He introduced the original, unedited audio recording of Gavin explicitly ordering the destruction of the access logs. He projected the original, encrypted text messages onto the massive courtroom monitors. He walked the judge through the exact email metadata that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Gavin was the primary architect of every single fraudulent transaction. The gavel fell with devastating finality. The federal judge did not just rule in my favor. She entirely dismantled Gavin's fraudulent empire. She legally nullified the predatory amendments to the corporate bylaws and completely voided the malicious share dilution. In a matter of minutes, my original controlling ownership was fully restored. Furthermore, she officially forwarded the forensic accounting reports to the federal prosecutor's office, opening a massive multi-agency door for severe criminal and civil indictments regarding wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the systematic forgery of legal documents. Gavin was no longer just a disgraced executive. He was a primary target of the federal government. The destruction carried over seamlessly into the family court proceedings later that month. Gavin had arrogantly assumed his wealth and his polished demeanor would secure him leverage over my child. He was entirely wrong. The family court judge took one look at the federal findings, specifically the testimonies proving Gavin had actively weaponized our son as a tool for corporate extortion and had planned to fabricate mental illness against a recovering mother. The ruling was swift and entirely uncompromising. I was granted full primary physical and legal custody of Noah. Gavin was stripped of his paternal leverage, reduced to strictly monitored, heavily scheduled visitation hours that he would likely spend consulting with his criminal defense attorneys. I had won the war. The glass tower, the offshore bank accounts, the board of directors, they all legally belonged to me again. The industry expected me to march back up to the 42nd floor, take my rightful seat at the head of the massive walnut table, and resume absolute control of Meridian Harbor. But that was the biggest, most satisfying twist of my entire counteroffensive. I did not want the throne he had stained. Using my newly restored absolute executive authority, I immediately convened a legally binding board meeting and initiated a massive, controlled demolition of the company. I forced the immediate liquidation of every single toxic asset Gavin had acquired. I sold off the bloated subsidiary contracts, canceled the luxury penthouse leases, and severed ties with every corrupt vendor in his network. Meridian Harbor, as a shiny, fraudulent brand, was completely erased from the market. I did not keep the glass tower. I did not keep the expensive mahogany boardroom. I kept only what was real. I extracted the original, pristine data vault I had built from scratch. I retained all the original intellectual property and the complex commercial insurance algorithms that actually generated honest, reliable revenue. I transferred the valid, ethical client roster, and I brought along the few, deeply loyal team members who had been quietly forced into the basement during Gavin's reign. 3 months later, the dust had completely settled. The criminal indictments against Gavin and Lenora were officially moving through the federal system, a severe problem they would have to face from the inside of a courtroom for the next several years. I was standing behind a solid, reclaimed wood desk in my brand new office. The company was officially named Kendrick Ledger Recovery. We were located in a much smaller, incredibly bright, and highly efficient converted industrial space across town. There were no expensive frosted glass walls, no velvet lounges, and absolutely no private dining suites. There were only massive whiteboards filled with real data, the steady hum of secure servers, and a team of brilliant people doing honest, meticulous work. It was the exact company I had always wanted to build, entirely stripped of the toxic ambition that had nearly killed me. The heavy glass door at the front of the office chimed softly. I looked up from my paperwork to see Tessa walking in, holding Noah's hand. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, right after school. Noah dropped his heavy backpack onto a sturdy leather sofa and walked directly over to my desk. He took a deep breath, his small nose crinkling as he took in the new environment. The space smelled strongly of freshly ground coffee, warm printer paper, and the sharp, clean scent of citrus cleaning supplies. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and entirely unburdened by the heavy, suffocating shadows of the past 3 years. He rested his hands on the edge of my desk and offered a small, knowing smile. "Mom," Noah said softly, "this place feels honest. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.